When billionaire Michael Harrington stumbles upon a poor guard's box by the river, his worldview shifts dramatically. He is drawn into a reality where his wealth only highlights injustices he once overlooked. What he decides to do next will surprise even the most jaded. But let's start at the beginning. Golden sunlight danced softly across the river's surface as Michael Harrington walked slowly along the bank, heavy thoughts pressing down like the autumn fog. Accustomed to managing millions, steering his vast company, and dictating terms in the financial world, Michael now felt oddly out of place in his own life. Tonight, it seemed he had nowhere left to escape from the burdens that had accumulated on his soul. His recent divorce, strained talks with a son who drifted further away, and a haunting emptiness despite his success and wealth. He wandered aimlessly along the river, searching for something to bring him peace, even if he didn't quite know what that was. Suddenly, his eye caught a glimmer by the water's edge. A small, slightly worn box, with faint designs faded by time, sat nestled among the cold, gray stones, almost as if waiting for someone to find it. Michael paused, examined the object, and then gently lifted it, surprised by its unexpected weight. Though the box seemed fragile, like an old family relic, it carried an undeniable presence that compelled him to open it. Slowly, as if careful not to disturb its age-old tranquility, he lifted the lid, revealing a delicate, intricately carved medallion shaped like two intertwined hearts. The simple symbol, preserving the warmth of someone's love, stirred an unexpected tenderness within him. But there was more. Beneath the medallion lay a folded, yellowed sheet of paper, hinting at secrets from another time. Michael's hands shook slightly as he unfolded it and read the words scrawled in a bold, though hurried handwriting. "To whomever finds this box, I leave my only joy and memory of the daughter I never got to see." The words evoked a deep, inexplicable sorrow. The name of the box's owner was unfamiliar, yet his heart ached as if for an old friend. Michael stood there on the riverbank, gazing at the letter as if it held hidden meaning, something he couldn't immediately grasp. He felt an unbearable sadness at the thought that somewhere there existed a person whose last memories he now held. Who was this person? Why had he never seen his daughter? What had happened to him? The question swelled like the incoming tide, and Michael realized he couldn't simply walk away from this mystery. The find awakened emotions he hadn't felt in years, a stirring of something deep within himself he hadn't known was there. Suddenly, he was determined to uncover the truth behind the box's owner. Returning home, Michael couldn't shake the words he'd read on the yellowed paper. "To whomever finds this box, I leave my only joy and memory of the daughter I never got to see." In a life where every decision was calculated and logical, an inexplicable call now arose, an awakening of long-dormant emotions. All night, he was unable to sleep. Images of the person who had owned this box filled his mind. Who was he? Why hadn't he seen his daughter? It seemed to Michael that this story hid layers of heartache and secrets he couldn't simply ignore. He felt an increasing obligation to uncover the truth. The next morning, clutching a strong coffee and still consumed by the same thoughts, he picked up his phone and called an old friend, a private investigator named Dan Rivers. Dan was one of the few people Michael trusted with delicate matters. Michael briefly explained his discovery of the old box, with its letter and medallion, belonging to an unknown man. It was vital to him to learn the identity of the owner, to discover his story, and perhaps locate his relatives. "Michael, you know these things take time, right?" Dan asked skeptically, accustomed to a client who valued precision and results. Without hesitation, Michael replied, "Do whatever it takes. Money is no issue. I want to know the truth." Dan promised to take on the case and began his work that very day. Over the next few days, Michael frequently found himself reflecting on how much he had and how little he ever considered it. His home was filled with treasures, with paintings on the walls worth more than some people could earn in a lifetime, and his possessions were custom-made by top artisans. Yet, he would have given it all up for just a moment of connection to understand the man who had left his daughter only a medallion and painful parting words. Finally, a few days later, Dan called, his voice tinged with restrained excitement. Michael immediately invited him to his office. The detective arrived with a small envelope containing all the information he'd gathered. Dan began by explaining that the box's owner was Robert Wilson, who had once worked as a guard at Michael's company. The name was vaguely familiar, but Michael couldn't recall a face. Dan continued. Robert died in a car accident about 10 years ago. He had a daughter who, as it turns out, is now living on the edge of poverty, raising 3 children. She works multiple jobs just to make ends meet. Robert was a quiet, unassuming man, but as we've learned, he loved his daughter deeply. He left her this box as a symbol of his love and forgiveness, even knowing she might never see it. Michael was shaken to the core. A profound tragedy had unfolded before him. A man who had humbly worked in the lowest ranks of his company had held such a painful story inside. To Michael, Robert had been just a name on the employee list, yet now he represented something much greater, a symbol of immense, unnoticed love and devotion. Michael felt a deep sense of responsibility toward Robert's daughter. How many times had he seen employees like Robert pass him by in the hallways, unnoticed, beyond his field of view? And here was one of them, once a watchful presence, quietly harboring such tender devotion, leaving only a modest but priceless treasure for his child. Collecting his thoughts, Michael made a resolute decision. He had to help this woman. She was the daughter of a man who had been nearly invisible to him, but left behind a powerful legacy of love and loyalty. Michael couldn't shake the sense of duty he felt toward Lily, Robert Wilson's daughter. Returning the box felt like only the first step. Something far greater remained to be done. He'd learned that Lily lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, and the more he uncovered about her life, the deeper he felt the chasm between their worlds. Lily was raising 3 children alone, working 2 jobs just to scrape by. This everyday reality of struggle and scarcity shook Michael profoundly. That evening, he drove himself to her home. Passing through neighborhoods where people barely kept afloat, he realized just how far removed he'd been from this world. Towering buildings plunged in shadows, narrow streets with dim signs, the sounds and bustle he was unaccustomed to. It all felt like another planet, foreign and harsh. Yet, this was where Robert's daughter lived, the person whose memory had so affected him. He stopped outside a worn, modest brick building. After checking he had the right address, he climbed the narrow, poorly lit staircase and finally knocked on the door. It was opened by a thin, pale woman with a weary face, her eyes carrying far more than she likely felt she could express. "Are you Lily Wilson?" he asked, feeling his shoulders unexpectedly tense. Her appearance, her face, was like a reminder of the unseen hardships he'd long overlooked. She nodded, looking slightly bewildered and clearly not expecting a visitor. Michael introduced himself, and feeling the awkwardness of the moment, asked if he could come inside to discuss something important. He felt awkward, like he was intruding into her life uninvited. There was a guarded look in her eyes, as if she was used to life handing her more struggles than blessings. Michael sat on a creaky chair in the cramped kitchen, the only place they could talk. Hesitating, unsure how to start, he finally told her about his find by the river. He showed her the box, explaining that he'd found it by chance and that it likely belonged to her father. Lily gazed at the box as if in disbelief. Her thin fingers trembled as she touched the tarnished medallion. At first, her face remained expressionless, but slowly, a faint spark warmed her eyes, a look of something tender, almost vulnerable. She whispered softly, "My father. He never mentioned anything like this. He was a quiet man, worked as a guard. We rarely saw each other." Her voice faltered, as if she were struggling to hold back a surge of emotions. Michael felt a tightening in his chest. He explained that despite life's challenges, her father had left her this symbol of his love. When he recounted the note he'd found, he saw tears slip down her cheeks. She could barely believe that the father she'd barely known had left her any kind of memory, that even in his modest position, he'd thought of her. "Thank you," she whispered finally, keeping her gaze lowered. "I never thought he would have left me something like this." Michael felt a rush of unexpected emotions. This was more than mere gratitude from Lily. It was a moment that fundamentally shifted his own outlook on life. He knew he needed to do something more for her. But how could he offer his help without it seeming like mere charity, without making her feel demeaned? He didn't want his money to come across as just another charitable gesture. He wanted his help to be meaningful and dignified.